So this week, we're going to talk about desirable difficulties and how they relate to creating branching scenarios. So first, we're going to experience a scenario. So as your homework, I'm going to ask you to go through a scenario and then turn something in to the assignments, just like you did last week. Then we'll think about scenarios and then we'll talk about desirable difficulty. So remember, whenever we create a case study scenario, we first identify the learning objectives. That's the subject matter. We only want to choose one specific objective that we want for the outcome. We choose our characters. We create the plot. We developed questions that help advance the plot forward. Those are the decision points that the learner makes. We only want to use a couple questions to guide them. And then we'll create some tension maybe between the characters or the content and develop a resolution. So those are our general steps for creating case study information. And remember, we've also then have our scenario rubric, which you are going to be using in this week's class to evaluate a kind of a fun and interesting cyber security based branching scenario. And it's actually called the Fugle. And the link is in your course, so you can click there. I want you to fill out that rubric, and then I want you to turn it in and make some comments. You did a great job last week, so we'll do the same thing this week as well. So let's then get to this concept of desirable difficulty. So how does the concept of challenging the learner in a scenario increase learning? What's the difference between a novice performer and somebody who's a top performer? And how do we get somebody from being a novice to being a top performer? And then what is this thing called deliberate practice? And then finally, how do we create expert performers based on the concept of desirable difficulty? So next, I want you to watch a little bit of a movie that I created in Beyond about desirable difficulties. I'll see you on the other side.
I don't understand why desirable difficulties in learning are desirable. Isn't learning supposed to be easy?
Actually, research shows that when learning is too easy, it doesn't promote long-term retention and transfer of knowledge.
What do you mean by too easy?
When information is presented in a straightforward manner, with no challenge or effort required to encode or retrieve it, it doesn't stick in our memory as well as when we have to work harder to learn it.
So, you're saying that desirable difficulties are beneficial because they require more effort to learn?
Exactly. Desirable difficulties are challenges that require encoding and retrieval activities that support long-term learning. They help us to remember and apply what we've learned better than if we just passively received the information.
But what about non-desirable difficulties in learning? Aren't those just frustrating and demotivating?
Non-desirable difficulties are different from desirable difficulties because they don't promote long-term learning. For example, if a task is too difficult and we don't have the necessary background knowledge or skills to complete it, we're likely to give up and not learn anything at all.
I see your point. So, desirable difficulties are beneficial because they promote encoding and retrieval activities that support long-term learning, while non-desirable difficulties can be demotivating and hinder learning.
Exactly. And it's important to note that what is desirable or non-desirable can vary depending on the individual and their prior knowledge and experience.
I think I understand now. Desirable difficulties are a good thing because they challenge us to encode and retrieve information, which leads to better long-term retention and transfer of knowledge.
Exactly. And by embracing these challenges, we can become better learners and retain information more effectively.
Okay, so now that you've seen that video, let's dive a little bit deeper into desirable difficulties. So let's look at the definition, right? Desirable difficulties are desirable because they respond to the challenges, right? Because responding to the challenges requires you as the learner or whoever the learner happens to be to encode and retrieve activities that support learning. There can be other types of difficulties in learning. They're called non-desirable difficulties, as pointed out in the video. But the key is the process of encoding the information. The desirable difficulty is in that encoding process. And the term desirable difficulties was coined by Robert and Elizabeth Bork and some research that they did about creating these things called desirable difficulty. It's interesting because instructors and students, a lot of us are susceptible to assuming that the conditions of instruction, where we're learning, that enhance performance during the instruction, like doing really well on quizzes or answering questions, that those kind of performances are the same conditions that enhance long-term learning. But that's not true at all. You might and the best example of this is you've crammed for a test, you've aced the test, and guess what? 3 weeks later, you don't remember anything that was on the test, right? But the conditions for learning were good. The conditions for immediate retrieval were good, but not long term. And what we want in many corporate and academic environments is to create long-term learning outcomes. So manipulations that speed the rate of acquisition during instruction actually can fail to support long-term retention and transfer, meaning the easier you get it in class, sometimes the harder it is to try to retrieve that information or transfer that knowledge to a different situation in the future. But manipulations that appear to create difficulties or slow the rate of acquisition can actually enhance post-instruction recall and transfer. So we want to work on ways to slow down the encoding, to make the encoding a little bit more difficult, to create more neurosynapses in our brain to that information, and then have that information be encoded. So what creates desirable difficulties? I guess the good thing is there's a bunch of stuff. So testing, forcing you to recall the information on your own time and time again. Spaced practice, which means doing a little bit of learning over time. That's where short sims come in. You can do a bunch of little short sims over a few month period rather than one really long, hours long sim. That can be helpful. Switching between topics, which is called interleaving. So for example, if you're teaching sales, how to sell a product, sometimes you'll go, here's sales skills, sales skills, sales skills. Then you'll go, oh, here's product knowledge, product knowledge, product knowledge. Here's competitor knowledge, competitor knowledge, competitor knowledge. But what we should really do is a little bit of sales, a little bit of competitor, a little bit of product, a little bit of product, a little bit of sales, a little bit of competitor. We should mix those up to create this thing called interleaving, where we interleave the concepts together. We also want to think about the freedom to fail. Allowing people to fail is okay when you're working with desirable difficulties. In many and some and a few academic situations, and even on the job, failure is looked at very poorly. Right? You failed, it's not good. But actually, failure is a learning tool, and desirable difficulties can capitalize on that. Organizing unfamiliar information, like, hey, I don't know what any of this means, any categories, but now I've got to categorize it. So that forces you to look through the information, categorize it. Generating ideas, generative learning, creation, that's great, instead of just reading or watching something. Self-feedback or metacognition, we'll talk about that. Varying the conditions of practice or learning. You probably learned that the best place to study is in the same place every time, total quiet. That's great for doing well on tests. And if you have to recall in the same place, totally quiet. But if you have to recall then out on the job or in a busy situation, the more different environments you have, the better it is for your learning perspective. And then transferring knowledge to new situations, forcing the learner to try new situations, new concepts. And that's great in branching scenarios, because we can take the learner who's learning something, and maybe in this kind of scenario, in our branching scenario, and then totally recreate a different environment. Maybe one's an office, maybe one's out in the field, maybe one's in a factory, maybe one's in a different country, maybe one's in poorly lit conditions, one's in great lit conditions, right? We can actually change that conditions of learning in our scenarios, which is why scenarios are a great tool for leveraging the power of desirable difficulties. We can also solving multiple types of problems at once, right? Instead of just having one kind of situation that somebody's in, maybe throw in a different situation into the scenario and have them solve that, allowing for confusion. And finally, one of my favorites is the Kobayashi Maru, which basically is a problem that has no solution, right? It's a no-win situation. It's from Star Trek, the original Star Trek with good old Captain Kirk. So you may want to check out the Kobayashi Maru. So how can we learn, right? one of the things to keep in mind is that we don't learn by making like a literal copy of the information. We're not photocopiers of the information. We learn by encoding and storing new information. The encoding process is actually a learning process, but also the retrieval process is a learning process, and most people forget about that. But when something goes into our head, we have the schema that it goes into, and we want to relate it to what we already know. We want to map new information onto current information and link that new information with existing information, right? We want to have these experiences of linking the information together. And as I said before, the act of retrieving information is itself a potent learning event, important learning event. When we retrieve information, it becomes more recallable the more times we retrieve it, and using our memory basically alters our memories, allows us to do that. So if we go back one slide, we can see that mapping new information. So we're going to learn something in this scenario. Maybe it's about communication, or maybe it's about leadership. And what we already know about leadership is still in our head, and we're going to anchor this new information to leadership. And as we recall our previous leadership training or experiences, that's going to mix in with what we're learning in the branching scenario and create the learning that the learner experiences. So we as designers of these scenarios, we actually don't create the learning, we create the condition in which learning occurs, and that's really important to think about. So our goal as a designer of instruction really is to create conditions that foster storage and enhance later retrieval in lots of different situations, right? Multiple contexts. The conditions of learning need to induce encoding and retrieval that are substantial and they're varied, and they incorporate incorporating desirable difficulties helps to induce that process, right? So if we add these desirable difficulties, we're varying the conditions, we're varying the ability to learn, we're slowing it down, maybe sometimes we're speeding it up. And that allows the learner to really have to work hard to get that information in. The harder you work to get it in, sometimes the easier it is to get it out, which is kind of nice. So here's some research that kind of backs this up, right? An experiment of college students to examine the effects of testing on fact memorization and language learning. So they're trying to see about using exams. One group was asked to keep testing themselves on all items without dropping what they were getting right. Sometimes you study something, I got that one right, I don't need to study it anymore. In this particular group, they got it right and they kept studying it. Oh, here it is again. Oh, I'm going to study. Oh, here it is again, right? The other group could drop them out. I don't need it. I got that. I know it. I got it. Interesting finding. The students who dropped items from testing remembered only about 35% of the words. But those who kept testing themselves, kept forcing themselves to recall that knowledge, and it's not fun once you know it to kind of recall it, they, however, improved as much as 80%. They could recall 80%. So that difficulty of having to recall what you already know, and it's not that difficult because you already know it, actually improved the learning in the long run. So going over things that you already know can actually be very helpful from a learning perspective. Now, in another study, immediate testing after reading a prose, so you read a passage of prose, they found that promoted better long-term retention than repeatedly studying the passage over and over again. So reading the passage, learning it over and over again was not as good as testing yourself on the content. And the outcome occurred even though the test included no feedback, like, hey, you got it wrong, or hey, try this differently, etc. In an experiment, students in the repeated testing condition recalled much more after a week than students in the repeated study, right? You're leading it, you're studying it, or hey, I'm going to read it and test it. The people that tested themselves did much better in the repeated condition, 61% versus 40%. And so 61%, over half, were able to do that. And even though students in the repeated testing condition read the passage only 3.4 times, so they only read it 3 or 4 times, then tested themselves, those in the repeated study actually read it 14 times and still didn't perform as well. So testing is so much better than just rereading content. Testing yourself is really helpful. So why is that helpful for us? Well, because it's helpful for us because we're then able to create a scenario where we don't want a lot of reading, we want a lot of questioning. We want the learner to answer a lot of questions as they go through. We want them to be able to recall that information based on our testing of them, not based on reading content in the scenario. So the more interactive, the more testing, the better it is for the learner when we create our interactive scenarios. Now, here's another one. Students who are tested over time have better recall than students who are simply asked to read, same kind of outcome. Participants who had been tested rather than rereading materials outperformed other students on 2 tests given 18 days later, and then as much as 5 weeks later. So what I'm getting here with this information is that recalling information because of testing is a powerful tool for learning. And in fact, it helps fight this thing called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which basically means we start out knowing a lot of information and then over time we forget more and more and more and more and more. But if we test, that brings back that information. We're like, oh, okay, I'm recalling that. Okay, I got it, and allows you to then move forward. So by testing people, by reminding them of content, we're circumventing the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. We're actually helping people to recall and learn that information better. Here's an example of, you forget a little bit, then you get that information, it goes up. Some people call it boosts. Then you forget a little bit slower, forget, here comes a boost, et cetera, et cetera. That's how micro-learning works. But it's also, as I said before, a great way to introduce short sims in situations where we want people to do maybe leadership skills or communication skills or some kind of social or power or soft skill. Now, here's a little bit more about interleaving. Basically, you're going to mix up instruction rather than covering one topic completely before you move on to another. So instead of a pattern, as I said before, sales, competitor analysis, product, you mix them up. So instead of AAA, BBB, CCC, you do a little bit of A, a little bit of B, a little bit of C, et cetera, et cetera. And it really helps to solidify the information. One of the thoughts is it's difficult. You have to keep switching. Like, oh, we're talking about sales. Oh, now we're talking about product. Oh, now we're talking about competitors. And you have to switch between those three. So go, yeah, sales, sales, sales. And it can be really effective. A lot of this research was done in the area of mathematics, where you're doing one kind of mathematic problem and then doing another kind of mathematic problem. And the theory there is that when you're doing a mathematic problem, if you know, oh, these are all multiplications by 5, you kind of like, you blank that out. Oh, multiplication by 5, yeah. But if you mix some multiplication by 6, multiplication by 7, then for every problem, you have to stop, process the information. Oh, is that 5 or 7? Okay, 7s work like this. Okay, you get that kind of information, and that's why it learns. And the concept of, sales, oh, I need this approach. Oh, content, I need to know this about it. That can help force the learner to switch thinking and doesn't make it easy for them. It's kind of like exercise or athletic training. You switch back and forth, it helps solidify all of your skills. So important, I repeated it twice, but actually learners should have, well, the caveat though, is that learners should have some familiarity with the subject materials before interleaving begins. Like if they don't know anything, then it's very hard to kind of understand it. So you have to kind of focus it in on what the learners know. Otherwise, it can be more confusing. So use this when you create your scenarios with content that people are familiar with. And the good thing is, people are familiar with a lot of soft skills, right? You're familiar with a little bit about leadership, a little bit about communication, maybe a little bit about sales. So that should be good as you put together this information. So another is freedom to fail. And basically, some research has found that individuals learn more from their own successes from their own failures. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Oh, I learn from failures. But this is interesting. Individuals tend to learn more from failures of others than others' success, which I think is fascinating. We all read these biographies of really successful people, or we look up to successful people. But when it comes to learning, we're like, hey, that person really messed up. I'm not doing that. So we learn what not to do. This actually goes back to Bandora's social learning theory. So how does this work then in a scenario? Well, if you see somebody fail in a scenario, you will learn from that failure more effectively than if you see somebody succeed. So let learners observe other people's failure. They can observe those failures. That can help them learn. So really kind of interesting piece of research there, I think. What you want to do is look at the research. And the research argues that success leads to local search, which basically that means is you're going, okay, I did that right, fine, good, I'm good to go, right? But failure leads to non-local search, like why did that guy fail? Well, that was really a huge mess up. Let me think of like, why did they mess up, right? So a lot of times if you mess up yourself, oh, I messed up because the lighting was bad, or I didn't study for the test, or I wasn't prepared, or this was a difficult customer. So you tend to like dismiss the failure and don't do reflection. If you see somebody else fail, you'd be like, why did that person fail? Man, they must not have done the work that they needed to do. Well, if I get in that situation, I'm going to do the work because I don't want to fail, right? So it's a really kind of interesting way to do that. And this study is based on work of cardiac physicians who watched other physicians kind of mess up cardiac surgery. And they're like, I don't want to do that. And so they actually learned more from those particular failures. And that was a study that showed that learners don't even have to be aware they're making a mistake for the brain to have increased electrical activity related to those mistakes. So it appears that the brain is challenged and struggles even if it doesn't know it's making a mistake, which is kind of interesting from a research perspective. So if you have a problem in front of you and you're struggling and you make a mistake, it's more electrical activity in the brain than if you get it. And even if you kind of like, I don't know if this is the right answer or not, I'm not sure, even if you eventually get the right answer, it still is building those neural pathways in your brain because you're struggling to figure out what the right answer is. So we've seen that we can actually learn from mistakes, and there are lots of different kinds of mistakes that people can make. So you can deviate, you can do something away from the norm or the standard. You can make a mistake because you're not paying attention. You can make a mistake because you have lack of ability, which is what scenarios are about, to give people that ability or that learning perspective. Maybe the process itself is broken. Some of these, we want to think about these mistakes aren't always fixable by us in learning and development or by branching scenarios. Like the task of leading a company might be too complex to teach in this branching scenario. There might be uncertainty about the future, and so you make a mistake because you're not sure. We can't provide certainty in every single case. Or maybe somebody's just exploring what to do wrong. Hypothesis and exploratory testing is really good for creating branching scenarios. People could say, well, what if I do this? Or what if I do that? What will happen? What will be the feedback? What will be the consequences? And if we consider in the branching scenario, when people make mistakes in the branching scenario, they choose the wrong option or they do something that we don't think is correct based on subject matter input and everything like that, we want to find out why. And then we wanted to make a decision. If somebody makes a mistake, are we just going to put them back a level and let them go through the scenario that way? Are we going to give them corrective feedback and then let them make the choice again? Are we going to give them corrective feedback and send them on the way? Or will we send them down an entire path that is incorrect so that they can learn from that mistake all of the consequences? So we as designers of the instruction have to take a look at the mistakes that will be made, the wrong answers or the incorrect answers, and then find out, well, what do we want to do with the learner if they make those mistakes? And we want to do that so that we can understand where and why mistakes happen, and then how to remediate those mistakes. We want to allow those mistakes, especially if they're common mistakes that we want to kind of nip in the bud back on the real world situation. But we also want to be aware of what mistakes learners are making as they go through and how to correct those mistakes. Another way to think about looking at desirable difficulties is having the learner organize unfamiliar information. Now, a lot of times in a branching scenario, we think, oh, you make a decision on 3 things, et cetera, but you could do things like, well, ask this, as the manager managing a project, organize this content that has come from a client. Like, oh, how do I do that, right? So that is one good way to add things. So when you think about a branching scenario, don't just think about, oh, we have to make a decision and go here, a decision and go here. Think about it more as a day in the life. Like, what would the person do? What would the person have to do? Maybe they have to sort some information. That can help from a learning perspective. Organizing unfamiliar information is important because experts notice features and meaningful patterns of information that novices don't. So once you have a novice with the content, organize it, then you can go back and say, well, how'd you organize it? Oh, okay, this, and this, and say, well, here's a different way to organize it. Here's how an expert would organize it. And be like, oh, okay, so I didn't think of that, right? And it gives them that extra bit of knowledge. Experts have acquired a great deal of content knowledge and organized in ways that reflect their understanding of the subject matter. So you can, again, if somebody organizes information in a branching scenario situation, we can then give them feedback about what an expert can do. And then finally, experts' knowledge really can't be reduced to a set of isolated facts or propositions, right? It really is conditioned. It's situational. So branching scenarios work really well because they put somebody in a situation. So if somebody's like, hey, they're having trouble like organizing, get their head around, competitor information, or organizing the development of new products, or organizing or managing projects, putting you in a branching scenario is going to really help with that because that's going to give you the context. It will help with meaning. It will help provide the learners with a way of organizing information. Let them try first, maybe scatter, maybe they don't do it well. But then the second pass where you give them that feedback on what was wrong and correct can be very helpful. Interesting things also, experts are able to retrieve information based on important aspects of the knowledge with a little bit, not much attention. Like a novice has to really focus. An expert can be like, oh yeah, these things. Well, how'd you do that? Well, I just know. Well, they don't just know. They've practiced over years. I worked with some experts who could tell when a piece of machinery was about to go bad because of the sound that it made. And they didn't have to pay a lot of attention. They would just walk by and go, oh, hey, that machine that needs to be checked. How'd you know that? And at first they would say, I don't know. I just know that machine needs to be checked. And you go, well, wait a minute. What about that machine made you stop? Come on, think about that. Was it the sight of the machine? No. Was it how the machine smelled? No. Was it how the machine moved? No. Was it how the machine sounded? Oh, yeah. So sometimes they don't even pay attention to it. So we have to debrief them. And then you can put that information into a branching scenario. Have a piece of machinery make a funny noise. And maybe the learner will, notice it and maybe not. But then you can go back and say, hey, go back to the machine and now see what happened. There was a noise there. Though experts know their discipline thoroughly, it doesn't mean that they're always able to teach others. We know that. So our job in creating the branching scenario is to help teach others. And also think that experts have various levels of flexibility in their approach to new situations. So some are very flexible, or some have a structured approach. So when you're talking to a subject matter expert about putting together a scenario, you want to try to find out, do you use a flexible approach or do you use kind of a step-by-step approach? What's the approach that you're using that we want to implement into our branching scenario and structure? Now, you want to encourage learners to create concept maps. And a concept map is just basically kind of, you have the concept in the middle and you have these different branchings so that they can figure out what's going on. That helps them represent, the concepts and big ideas. And you want to focus on concepts and big ideas. You might even create an exercise. I've seen this in branching scenarios where a learner has to do a drag and drop of elements in a concept map. And that can be very helpful for people understanding how things are related to one another and how an expert views a domain of knowledge. So another way to think about this is generating ideas, right? summarization, sketching, manipulating objects on the screen. A good way to learn something is always to teach it to write an essay, critical thinking. So can you have the learner, for example, write an email to a subordinate who comes in late to work, right? Instead of saying, which do you want to pick, or have them write it out. And nowadays with the ability of ChatGPT and things like that, we can actually double check the essay that they wrote and find out, hey, is this a decent essay or not a decent essay? Ask the learners to generate targeted material through an active creative process that you put into place as you create your scenario. This can involve like role playing. It can involve, if it's face-to-face structured debates or puzzles, or something as simple as writing up an outline for a proposal and having it checked automatically, or writing up an email or getting feedback. Those kinds of things can help because they're generative. And so when you create your branching scenario, how can you think about ways that you want the learner to generate ideas or concepts or artifacts? Now, another way that experts are different than novices, and another way that we can create desirable difficulty is force people to think about their own thinking. Often called metacognition, right? Learners who use metacognition are better able to solve transfer problems. That means transferring one concept to another. So one of the complaints sometimes about branching scenarios is that it's really hard. People don't, they solve that branching scenario, but then they don't think about it like back on the job, or they don't think in other situations. So perhaps in your branching scenario, you want to coach the learner a little bit on thinking about transferring this knowledge. Hey, you just learned this and this and this. Think about strategies you could use to transfer this knowledge to a similar situation. Or think about how you might use this information at home or with your friends or something like that. And also try to keep it positive. Negative self-evaluation statements actually decrease metacognitive processes, right? So say, hey, positively think about this, positively think about that. Give them positive statements that they can mimic and think about so that they don't get into the, oh, I don't know how to do this, oh, this is too hard, oh, this doesn't make sense. Like that's negative, and that's not going to help with metacognition. But keep this in mind, people do not spontaneously use metacognitive strategies, right? It's very rare that somebody naturally says, oh, well, let me reflect on, let me think about this, it doesn't happen. So you as a designer of the scenario might want to say, hey, here are 3 strategies you can use to think about expanding this to other situations, or here's 3 ways to think about this content. So you provide the learner with the metacognitive structure that they can put in the information and help them develop skills at self-explanation, metacognitive processes. It's really helpful for lifelong learning. Now, another thing that you can do is vary the conditions of practice or learning. We talked about that. Even varying the setting. And again, in a branching scenario, very easy to do because we can change the images, we can change the background, we can change the characters. So you can have lots of different settings. Now, you also want to change a little bit of the dialogue or the situation that occurs. You don't just want to do it randomly, but you can, if you're careful about it, change the situation enough, change the characters enough, change the actual interactions enough that it will vary the conditions of learning and help the learners see the applicability across a wide variety of situations. And when you transfer knowledge to new situations, you want to, follow this process, right? Initially learn what's necessary for transfer. Then you need knowledge that is overly contextualized to be eliminated, right? If it's too specific to this situation, you can't transfer it. And let the learners know, hey, some of the information is going to be very specific to this case, but other pieces of information such as this, this, and this can be transferred focused on that. And focus that by creating abstract representations of knowledge. The abstraction, like, oh, here's a general process, or here's general questions that I need to ask, or here's a general situation and how I should approach it, it's going to help you abstract that information, that concept, that learning from one scenario, branching scenario to another. And transfer is best viewed as an active process. So if you can, have the learners generate what they think are the transferable skills and then have them apply that. Ask them to generate those ideas. So you can check them with an expert, give them hints and tips, give them situations where they have to do it. The more you can have them practice and apply, the better off. And keep in mind that all new learning involves transfer based on previous learning, right? We've already been born, we're raised, we're dealing with adult learners. There's some knowledge that they already have. They're not totally naive. So we are transferring that based on previous knowledge. So if you can tap into that previous knowledge, that can be very helpful as well. And also, it's been written by Bork and others, but this is a quote from Bork, but the vehicle by which a chunk of reality is brought into the classroom to be worked over to the class and the instructor, right? So basically what you want to do as someone creating instruction is create a case that's grounded on stubborn facts, stubborn pieces of information that occur in the real world that people have to manipulate. That manipulation can be very helpful for solving multiple types of problems all at once. Give them a bunch of different problems related to a situation or a bunch of different situations related to a specific problem and have the learners solve that. And allow for confusion. Expose learners to confusing material. I think one of the mistakes we make in instructional design a lot is we dummy down the material to the point where people don't care. Right? That's so simple. It's so easy. I don't care. So make it confusing, at least to start with. Let them try to figure it out. Again, that's cognitive processing that you've got to go through and figure out. Maybe withhold some answers. Maybe test before somebody even learns something. Providing that little bit of sense of confusion, that desirable difficulty can be helpful. So start a branching scenario situation that's kind of confusing. Like you might not really know what's going on. You might not understand everything. And then as it unfolds, the learner will go, okay. Again, Malcolm Knowles talks about adult learners learning best when they know they don't know something. And when you confuse a learner, cause a little bit of frustration, then the learner goes, I don't know that, I don't know what I'm doing, and they're more open to learning. It's a balancing act, though. We don't want them so frustrated that they leave or they quit. So you kind of have to be careful with that. As I talk about often in games, one of the ways that they do that is have different levels of help, right? Give me a vague hint, give me more targeted information, or tell me the answer, right? You could go through 3 levels of help so that the learner doesn't get too confused as they go through your scenario. So something to think about. And then this is the Kobayashi Maru, right? The seemingly impossible challenge. But it actually, research shows that increased challenges during at least math class produce better long-term performance. So if you can challenge the learner once they accomplish something more and more and more and more, that will help lead to better long-term performance. If it's easy, that's not going to be as effective as challenge. So keep that in mind as you're creating these branching scenarios. Can you make them more challenging as the scenario continues, or a bunch of scenarios with are challenging? So that's what I want to talk about in terms of desirable difficulties, in terms of looking at challenges for learning, and should give you enough information that you can think about applying some of that to your own branching scenario. And don't forget about the assignments, and I will see everybody next week.